Hey everyone. So I figured the easiest way to transfer my material to this online format would be to do a PowerPoint with a voiceover. So what I'm going to do is transfer most of my notes from the book onto the PowerPoint slides. I'll have the page number listed in red on the left-hand side of the slide so you can see where I'm getting the information from in the book. While you're going through this, have your book out and we're going to kind of go through it together. So I'm going to re-explain things, give helpful hints and tips for taking the exam, and hopefully with the page numbers up there, it'll be smooth. You can tell where I'm at in the book and so forth. A lot of students take, for my past sessions, their notes in a specific color that's bright, like a pink, orange, red, something that they know is coming from, so you know all of the notes that are in that color are coming from past and nowhere else. So I definitely recommend doing that. Another important note I want to make before we get started, if you're not going to class, make sure you start going to class. It's going to be super important for doing well in this course. CNS is known as one of the toughest courses in first trimester, so you got to go to class if you want to do well. If you're going to class and watching these videos, doing all the past stuff, then you guys should be set pretty good for success in this class. I get a lot of great feedback from past sessions, so hopefully we can keep that going even though it's on this whole new online learning format. If you guys have any questions, just email me at my name, mimi.mcparland@palmer.edu. You can shoot me a message on Facebook, whatever's easiest. And yeah, go ahead and get started. Actually, before we get started, I do want to make one more point to go along with what I was saying on the previous slide. So this is a pass program. It's intended to help you pass the class. Sometimes I get some feedback on this course saying that I didn't cover all the information or I missed a few things or something. That's what class is for, to teach you all the information. That's why I said you should be going to class, because pass is focusing on getting you ready for the exam and doing well on the exams, passing the course. So I just wanted to mention that to let you know what to expect from this. I do cover most of the information, but just to kind of give a disclaimer on this whole pass program. All right, so now we can go ahead and get started. I'm on page 1, starting from the top, Introduction to the Nervous System. So on this page, there's a few things that I would definitely make sure you're aware of and know for the exam. First one is the role of the nervous system. That's that first bullet I have there. Coordination, association, and integration. Make sure you know those 3 words. That's the function of the nervous system. Coordinates, associates, and integrates the body's responses to internal and external demand. An easy way I remember that for the exam is the first letter of each word makes CIA. So I kind of told myself that the nervous system is our body's CIA. And then from there you have to remember which word those letters stand for. So that was an easy way for me to remember that. How you might see that on the exam is he can ask in a multiple choice question, maybe something like, which of the following is not a function of the nervous system? He would have coordination, association, integration up there, and then maybe another word, I don't know, inspiration might be one of the options. You would pick that one because the question is asking which of the following is not a function. So you pick the one that's wrong there. Make sure you're aware that of these next 2 points, the nervous system has little capacity to store oxygen or sugar. Glucose is written there in parentheses because that's the form that sugar is stored in. When it's stored in the nervous system, it says little capacity. So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, nervous system is not storing oxygen or sugar, and it maintains little mitotic capacity. So mitotic capacity is cell division, right? So if you think about it, if you have an injury to a muscle, or let's say you accidentally cut yourself, those types of injuries pretty much heal back to the state they were in before you injured yourself, right? They heal pretty easily and quickly. Whereas if you think about somebody injuring a nerve or any kind of injury that involves the nervous system, that doesn't heal quickly or probably to 100% because of that bullet right there, maintains little mitotic capacity. You need cell division to heal. So if you think about that, that should help you remember that. All right, moving on to page 2. So we've got the subdivisions of the nervous system here, starting out with the CNS and PNS. So CNS, central nervous system, that's what this whole course is over. We're going to learn all about the brain and the spinal cord. The PNS is the peripheral nervous system. So think in the periphery once we leave the central nervous system. You have a whole nother course on that in third trimester. Dr. Torgard also teaches that. For this class, pretty much you just got to know what's listed here for the exam. Going back to the CNS, so the two parts of the CNS are the brain and spinal cord. If it's not, rule of thumb, if it's not the brain and it's not the spinal cord, it is not the CNS. So only two structures in the CNS. Another rule of thumb for this course, if you ever see anything in parentheses, make sure you know what it means. I know in the past, when I took different courses, and a lot of other students do this, you see stuff in parentheses and you're like, oh, it's just in parentheses, so I don't have to know it. That is not true for this class. Make sure you know everything that's in parentheses. And how he can trick you is he won't necessarily ask on an exam, what is another word for the brain? And you'd have to write or put as your answer encephalon. But he could ask a question referring to the encephalon or the brain, but because you don't know what the word encephalon means, you can't answer the question. So make sure you know the synonyms that are in parentheses throughout the book, and I'll have them up on the slides as well. So our brain and spinal cord are our central nervous system. They're the midline structures. Once we leave those, we are in the PNS. So we're looking at these structures down here. So we have 12 cranial nerve pairs and 20 or 24 total cranial nerves. That's what CN stands for, cranial nerves. And I know you guys probably took your appendix quiz on the cranial nerves already, so you should be aware of those. Know that there's 12 pairs. On the exam, look out for whether he's asking for pairs or total. Those are easy points to miss if you don't read the question carefully. So look out for whether he's asking for pairs or total. And then we have 31 spinal nerve pairs or 62 total spinal nerves. So our cranial nerve pairs, cranial nerves are leaving the cranium or the brain. So 12 leaving the brain, specifically the brain stem, whereas the 31 spinal nerves, so spinal nerves, are coming from the spinal cord. So that's what's happening there. And then there's a note in the book that if you add both of these numbers, then you have 86 total nerve trunks. So know those numbers. Again, look out for pairs or total, whether he's asking for on the exam. And then we have ganglia. So ganglia are groups. When I was first learning this, every time I saw ganglia, I would say like ganglia groups to help me remember that. And I'll talk about it probably almost every section from here on out. I'll mention the DRG. DRG is a dorsal root ganglion. If you don't have a note written in your book yet, I would put that there. Dorsal root ganglion is a group of cell bodies carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. So write that down if you don't have that written. By the time we get to finishing exam 1 material, it will all come together. But dorsal root ganglion is carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. It's a group of cell bodies. So it's a big distractor because it's close to the spinal cord, the dorsal root ganglion. They're right next to the spinal cord, but they are not the spinal cord and they are not the brain, so they are considered PNS structures. So that's a good distractor if you were to ask a question on which of the following is not a part of the CNS. That would be your answer, dorsal root ganglion. It's a good distractor. So make sure you're aware of that. DRG is the PNS. I know I'm being a bit repetitive here, but hopefully it's helping you learn the information. Before we move on, I just want to mention something about the appendix quizzes. I posted something on your Facebook page, but in case you didn't see that, just want to make you aware. I don't cover any of the appendix material. The reason for that is because you don't see too much of that information or really any of it on the exams. So take the quizzes, get your points, but Don't worry about going back and like studying all that information and rememorizing it when it comes time to take the test, because he's not going to test you on those terms again. The appendix quizzes are to get you familiarized with the foundation and terms that will be used in the book. So I've got a lot of other information to cover that will be on the exam. That's why I don't cover those. All right, moving on. So we're still on page 2. We just talked about the CNS and PNS. Those are structural divisions of the nervous system. Now we're going to be getting into the functional divisions. So we're looking at first the somatic component. On the next page, we're going to see the other component is the autonomic, just to preface what's to come. But now we're looking at somatic. So everything that I've titled in here or written is pretty much the important stuff you got to know for the exam. What does it innervate? Is it voluntary or involuntary? What neurochemical is released? And how many neurons to get to the target cell? Those are the questions you should be concerned with. So the somatic component innervates skeletal musculature. It is voluntary. It releases ACH, and it's only one neuron to get from the CNS to the target cell. I feel like a lot of students prior to getting to Palmer have learned this stuff already, so this should hopefully be kind of a review for you. I know you guys might be studying like the ACH and the synapse and gross, so maybe there's a little overlappage there, but should make sense. If you're aware that somatic innervates skeletal musculature, it should make sense that it's voluntary. If you think about our skeletal musculature, that's all stuff that we can control. We control when we want to flex our bicep or whatever kind of movement you want to do. It's voluntary. ACH is released there. Be aware that it's excitatory, which again should make sense, because if you want to, let's say, flex your fingers, you need a chemical that's going to excite the neuron to make that happen rather than inhibit. If you inhibit it, nothing's going to happen. And then this word here, cholinergic, be aware of this term too. He could ask you a question on the exam of which of the following would not be a cholinergic system, or which of the following is a cholinergic system. For that question, a good answer would be somatic. And if you look at the word cholinergic and you look at the word acetylcholine, they both have that term choline in it. So that helps me remember that acetylcholine being released at the target cell makes it a cholinergic system. We're going to talk about another division, the sympathetic, on the next page. The sympathetic division of the autonomic component of the nervous system. At the target cell, norepinephrine is being released rather than ACH, so that would not be a cholinergic system. That's an adrenergic system, and we'll get there just to kind of get you familiarized with the words before we get to that slide. So somatic, cholinergic system, it's voluntary, innervating skeletal musculature, and acetylcholine is being released there. There's only one neuron to get from the CNS to the target cell. And you guys have, in your book, you should have drawn out a schematic showing that there's one neuron to get from the CNS to the target cell. In this case, our target cell is going to be muscle. So you might want to write that down if you don't have that written down. Next, before we move on, I just want to take your attention to the kind of right side of the page where I have same written in caps. So this was helpful for me to remember if I get mixed up between afferent versus efferent. So sensory information is information going towards the CNS. Motor information or movement is information going away from the CNS. I usually wait a few pages to go over this, but we'll just go through it now. So sensory is going to be another word for afferent, or afferent neurons are carrying sensory information, whereas efferent neurons are carrying motor information. So if you get mixed up which one's efferent or afferent, write out the word same, then you have it goes in the order. Sensory is afferent, motor is efferent. So that's a little helpful trick that I use if I get mixed up. All right, so we are moving on to page 3 now. We just talked about the somatic component. Now we're looking at the autonomic component. So you can see there next to autonomic, we've got visceral in parentheses. So make sure that you know that those are interchangeable. Autonomic, aka visceral component of the nervous system. Our target cells here are going to be not skeletal musculature, but glandular epithelium, smooth, and cardiac muscles. So make sure again that you know which ones are being targeted here. He can ask you that in a fill in the blank, most likely multiple choice question. It could be which of the following is not targeted in the autonomic component of the nervous system. You could have A, B, C, D, glandular epithelium, smooth, cardiac musculature, and then skeletal musculature. If he asks which of the following is not, you would pick skeletal musculature. So that's how you could see that on there. Make sure you know the difference between somatic and autonomic. Autonomic component is going to be involuntary, which if you look at the target cells, it should make sense. We said when you want to move a muscle with somatic or skeletal musculature, that's something you voluntarily do. When we're looking at this autonomic stuff, if we've got cardiac musculature, for example, you don't tell your heart to beat 24/7. You don't tell your GI tract, your glandular epithelium to be working or moving 24/7 or after you eat to digest. This is all involuntary stuff. So that's the big point there. So now we're going to divide into parasympathetic and sympathetic subdivisions of the autonomic component of the nervous system. We're seeing parentheses again. So the sympathetic stuff is on the next page, page 4, but I'm going to talk about them together because you want to know the differences between the two. They're kind of opposites. So if you remember that, that might help you. Parasympathetic is vegetative. Make sure you know that term as well. A lot of people say parasympathetic is our rest and digest function, whereas sympathetic is going to be fight or flight. So that's like the neurons that fire if you see a bear and you got to get away. I'm sure you've heard that plenty of times. Running away from a lion, being chased by a bear, fight or flight. That's sympathetic. After you've realized the bear is no longer there or whatever, and you're going to calm down, you're going to rest, that's when your parasympathetic functions start to kick in. So looking at parasympathetic subdivision, the levels of nerves that you absolutely 100% need to know: cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, sacral nerves 2, 3, and 4. Jumping down to sympathetic, the levels are going to be T1 to L2. Make sure you know the exact levels. How he can trick you on the exam is he can ask you a question, for example, at what levels is the sympathetic subdivision of the nervous system present? And the answer could be, so the answer is T1 to L2. That could be A. B could say T1 to L1. C could say T2 to L2. So you see how he could change it just slightly. So you have to make sure you know the exact levels. In the book on page 4, it says T1 to and including L2. So make sure you're aware of that. When we talked about this somatic component, we said there was one efferent neuron to get from the CNS to the target cell. Now looking on this slide, and you can see I've drawn out in pink, blue, and black, that's representing there's 2 efferent neurons to get from the CNS to the target cell. So with the autonomic stuff, we have a preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic meaning before it reaches the ganglion. Remember we said a ganglion is a group of cell bodies, right? So in order to get, let's use heart as an example because that's what I have here. That's the gland or the target cell we're affecting. If it's parasympathetic function, it takes 2 neurons to get there. The first one, the pink one, is going to synapse on a ganglion. And then that next short one is going to be the postganglionic neuron going to the heart. I drew it out in color because you have to know when it comes to sympathetic or parasympathetic which preganglionic or postganglionic neuron is short or long. So you have to know that. I have it in caps. If you look under D, parasympathetic, you'll see preganglionic is long, postganglionic is short. Both of them are releasing ACH. You need to be aware of that as well. So just like with the somatic component we talked about, skeletal musculature, it's also going to be cholinergic because they're both releasing ACH. The important thing that determines that parasympathetic subdivision is cholinergic is the second one, postganglionic, releasing ACH, because that is where the target cell is being affected. ACH is being released at the target cell. I'm going to skip down to sympathetic because it's different. The very last thing I've got written for sympathetic is postganglionic. So that would be the second efferent that actually synapses with the target cell is releasing norepinephrine. So the target cell is getting norepinephrine. So that is going to be called an adrenergic system. So we've got parasympathetic is releasing both ACH at the pre and postganglionic. Sympathetic is releasing ACH at the preganglionic synapse, but norepinephrine at the postganglionic synapse. You have to know, if he gives any example, what is being released at the synapse. An easy way to remember that, the only other one we talked about is the somatic subdivision on the previous slide. That also releases ACH. So you'll notice, and I have them all highlighted in yellow, every neuron is going to release ACH except the one at the bottom there, postganglionic sympathetic, releases norepinephrine. If you remember that one is norepinephrine, that one is adrenergic. The rest of them release ACH. So to make it easier on yourself, I would memorize that last one, postganglionic sympathetic releases norepinephrine. The rest, any other example he gives you, is going to release ACH. One last thing on this slide, I can't remember if I mentioned it, so we'll talk about it again maybe. You have to know whether the preganglionic or postganglionic is going to be short or long. So our first example, looking at parasympathetic, I have that underlined in pink. The preganglionic is going to be long. That's opposite from sympathetic, which I have underlined in blue. The preganglionic sympathetic is short. So how I remembered this, because it basically comes down to straight memorization here. You don't learn about the anatomy and all that until gross 2 when you actually see what's going on in the cadaver lab. So how I remember it for the exam when I was in first try is I look at the word. Parasympathetic is a longer word than sympathetic, so that helped me remember that parasympathetic preganglionic is long. Sympathetic is a shorter word, so that helped me remember preganglionic sympathetic is short. So I use the word to help me remember how long the preganglionic one is for both of those. And then the next one, the postganglionic, is just opposite. So I know that's kind of wordy, saying preganglionic, postganglionic, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Go over it a couple times. It's kind of hard to explain these things when I can't show a laser pointer or point it out on the slide, so I apologize about that, but hopefully that helps you remember, but you do have to know, like I said, which one's long and short for both subdivisions. All right, so the very last part on page 4, you guys need to be aware of the functions of parasympathetic versus sympathetic. He does ask questions on that on the exam. So they're going to have opposite effects on the same organ. So this is just listing the examples. If you know one really well, if you know all the sympathetic effects really well, parasympathetic is just going to be the opposite. So I'm going to jump down to the sympathetic first, that fight or flight in red. We're going to go through those. So sympathetic, I'm sure you all have heard, getting chased by a lion or bear or some scary animal. What effect are the sympathetics going to have? So you're going to have your heart rate's going to increase or speed up because you're scared and you need to get away, right? You're going to start running. Your heart rate is going to increase. Peristalsis, which controls digestion, will decrease. That should make sense because if you're going to die if you don't get away from this bear, your main concern is getting away. Your body's not going to be concerned with digesting your meal from earlier, right? So peristalsis decreases. And then we have dilated pupil and dilated respiratory tree. I'm going to explain the respiratory tree dilation. So if it's dilating, that's opening up so you can get more flow, respiratory tree, so you're getting more flow to your lungs, allows more air, more oxygen so that you can fuel your muscles so you can continue to run away. Hope that makes sense. So if you're dilating a respiratory tree, the reason I underline dilate is so you can remember that the other example is going to be dilate as well for sympathetic. And then if you go ahead and look at the parasympathetic examples, it's going to be the opposite. So you'll have constriction of your pupil and constriction of the respiratory tree. Heart rate is going to slow. So rest and digest. You had gotten, you're safe and sound from this lion. Your heart rate can finally slow down, which means peristalsis, is going to speed up because now you can finally digest. Your body can worry about digesting the meal you had for breakfast or whatever it may have been. So big idea, parasympathetic and sympathetics are opposites. So know one really well, and then the other is just going to be the opposite. All right, moving on to page 5. Big thing here is knowing the ratios of preganglionic to postganglionic neurons and what that means. So starting from the top, sympathetic actions are more general and widespread. The reason for that is because of the ratio. So it only takes one preganglionic neuron to excite 17 postganglionic neurons. Jumping down to parasympathetic, it's more precise because one preganglionic neuron only excites 2 postganglionic neurons. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, if you draw it out, you can kind of see if one neuron is exciting 17, that kind of shows how it's more widespread for sympathetics, whereas one for parasympathetics is only exciting 2. Another way to help me remember this is I think about say you see a lion and you're like, oh shit, gotta get out of here. Your heart rate is spiked. You're running. You're like, your sympathetics are going. That happens really fast, right? It's widespread. Well, let's say you turn and realize it was actually a shadow and not a lion. It's going to take longer for you to bring your heart rate down and to kind of get in that rest and digest mode. That's because of this ratio here. Parasympathetics are more precise. So that helps me remember in general, parasympathetic is more precise, sympathetic is more widespread. But you do have to know the ratios, so make sure you know which ones go with which and which numbers they are. All right, so looking at page 6, I don't have anything up on the slide about it because it's just a diagram. This is not a testable diagram, so don't worry about this showing up on the exam. But I like looking at this diagram because it shows a couple different things. It shows the sympathetic versus parasympathetic levels where you can find those neurons. So T1 to L2 you can see is sympathetic. And then you have your parasympathetic or cranial sacral nerves. Those cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10 and S2 through 4 are also labeled. This actually, what I like that this shows is parasympathetic. So if you take the word para, that means like on either end, right? So parasympathetic, if you look at the diagram, you can see how it makes sense because you have the cranial sacral division that's on either side of the sympathetic division T1 to L2. I hope that made sense the way I explained it. But so yeah, I like the diagram for that. And then it also shows the preganglionic versus postganglionic nerves. If you look at the sympathetics on the right, that the preganglionic sympathetics coming from the spinal cord are short. They're synapsing on this like kind of stalk-looking thing. That's representing the sympathetic chain ganglion. So preganglionic, sympathetic, synapses on the chain ganglion right there. So that's short. And then from there, you can see the postganglionics are longer. Parasympathetics are opposite, right? So looking on the left side of the page, let's take the lung for an example. You can see the preganglionic parasympathetic is long going to it. And what it's showing, the dotted line is the postganglionic parasympathetic. That's way shorter, right? So preganglionic parasympathetics get pretty close to the organ before they synapse on the postganglionic sympathetic. So I like that diagram for showing those two things, but like I said, they won't show up on your exam. It's just a good visual of everything. So that's what I like that for. Moving on to page 7, pretty much the only thing to be aware of on this page is that you have the enteric system. That's the third subdivision of the autonomic component of the nervous system. So we talk all about parasympathetic and sympathetic. We focus on that, but just be aware that there is a third subdivision, and that's the enteric system. That is the intrinsic system of the gut. So be aware of that, but I wouldn't worry about too much more about that note. And that wraps up everything for Unit 1. So that's the end of this lecture and voiceover. I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any questions, let me know. And good luck studying.